You have walked past more dead birds than you will ever know about, not metaphorically. Literally. In the last 12 months. Somewhere on your street, in your local park, on a rooftop you never look up at. A bird died within 100 meters of where you were standing. You didn't see it. You weren't supposed to. And that single sentence is the beginning of one of the strangest unsolved questions in everyday biology. A question so common that almost every person on Earth has asked it without realizing they were asking. Something that scientists have spent real careers trying to answer. Where do the bodies go? Stay with me, because the answer is not what you think. And the second half of it is even stranger than the first. Think about how many birds you've actually seen in your life. Thousands. Maybe. Tens of thousands if you count every sparrow on a wire, every pigeon on a sidewalk, every cardinal flashing red against winter snow. Birds are, without exaggeration, one of the most visible forms of wildlife most humans will ever encounter. They are everywhere. They are elude. They are constant. And yet, if you sat down right now and tried to remember the last time you saw a dead one not on a road, not flattened by a car, but a bird that had simply died of natural causes, lying somewhere in the open, you would probably struggle. Some people can't remember a single instance in their entire life. That should bother you more than it does. Here is where the numbers start to get uncomfortable. Researchers studying bird survival have found that for many songbird species, only around 20 to 25% of birds hatched in a given year survive to see their first birthday. Read that again? Not 50%? Not a coin flip. For the vast majority of small birds born this spring, somewhere between 75 and 80% of them will be dead before next spring arrives. And for the ones that do survive into adulthood, the danger doesn't stop. Annual adult mortality in species like the American robin sits around 50%, the European starling around 53%, and in some sparrows it climbs past 70% in a single year. This is not a slow trickle of death. This is a continuous, brutal, high-volume churn that never stops running in the background of every yard, every park, every patch of forest on the continent. So do the math with me for a second, because this is where the scale of the mystery actually becomes visible. North America is home to billions of land birds at any given moment, if even half of those birds are dying within any given year. And for many species, the number is far higher than half. You are talking about a death toll that should, by simple statistical logic, be leaving evidence everywhere. You should be tripping over carcasses. You should see them under feeders, along fence lines, in gutters, on lawns, but you don't. And here's where it gets worse before it gets clearer. The absence isn't a glitch in your attention. It is not that you're simply failing to notice something that's plainly there. The bodies are genuinely, almost completely gone. Something is erasing them faster than you can register they ever existed. This is the point where most explanations stop being satisfying, because most people assume the answer is something simple like predators eat them and leave it there. But that explanation doesn't hold up under real scrutiny, because predation alone cannot account for the sheer completeness of the disappearance. What's actually happening is far more layered, far more mechanical, and once you understand it, far more unsettling than a simple food chain explanation. There isn't one system removing the evidence of bird death. There are at least 3 overlapping systems, each operating independently, each one closing off a different avenue where you might otherwise see what's really happening around you every single day. The first layer of this disappearance begins before death even occurs, and it starts inside the bird itself. When a bird becomes sick, injured, or begins entering the terminal stage of a disease, something changes in its behavior almost immediately, and it is not a conscious decision in any way comparable to human planning. It is older than thought, wired in at the level of instinct. A healthy bird spends its life in open or semi-open space, because open space is where it can see a predator approaching and where it has room to escape. The moment a bird's body signals that it can no longer fly fast, see clearly, or react in time, that openness becomes a death sentence. And the bird's instincts respond by doing the only thing that has ever worked across millions of years of evolutionary pressure. It disappears into cover, thick underbrush, the dense interior of a shrub, tangled ground vegetation, the shadowed base of a hedge. These are not random hiding places. They are the same locations a healthy bird uses to evade predators during ordinary daily life. And in the final hours of a compromised bird's existence, they become something else entirely. A place to die unseen. This is not strategy in the way a human plans an exit. It is a threat response that has no off switch, firing exactly the same way whether the threat is a hawk circling overhead or a disease quietly shutting down the bird's organs from within. And here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. The very same behavior that protects a bird from predators while it's dying is the behavior that conceals its body afterward. The hiding doesn't stop when the heart does. The cover that saved it in life becomes the grave that erases it in death. Now, push that thought a little further, because this is where the picture widens. If you went out right now and physically pushed apart the branches at the base of every overgrown shrub in your neighborhood, parted the tall grass along every fence line, looked underneath every dense hedge, you would almost certainly find more dead birds than you've seen in years of casual walking. But you won't do that. No one does that. We walk past dense vegetation every single day without a second glance, because there is nothing visually compelling about a shadowed gap beneath a bush. And so the bodies remain exactly where instinct placed them, not removed, not destroyed, simply never visible to begin with. The mystery of the missing dead bird starts here, with a species-wide habit of dying somewhere you are never going to look. But concealment alone does not explain everything. And this is where the story escalates into something far more aggressive than quiet hiding. Because birds do still die in the open, sometimes on lawns, on driveways, on sidewalks, in plain daylight. And even then, the bodies vanish with startling speed. Researchers studying urban and suburban bird mortality have tracked how long an exposed small bird carcass typically remains visible in an area with an active scavenger population. And the window is shockingly short, often somewhere between 30 minutes and 4 hours. 4 hours. Think about how much of your day that represents. If a bird dies overnight, which a large number of sick or weakened birds do, because nighttime is when a failing metabolism finally loses the battle to maintain body temperature. The body is frequently gone before you've even woken up, before your coffee has finished brewing, before the sun has fully cleared the horizon. So who exactly is doing the removing? This is where most people's mental image is completely wrong. You're picturing vultures circling overhead, or a coyote dragging a carcass into the woods. Some dramatic visible event you'd notice happening. That is not the primary mechanism at all. The real machinery of disappearance is smaller, quieter, and far closer to your daily life than you've ever considered. It starts with insects, ants, beetles, flies, which can locate and begin working on a bird carcass within minutes of death in warm weather, stripping soft tissue with a speed that borders on industrial efficiency. But insects are only the opening act. The real disappearance is driven by animals you already know intimately. Animals that live in your own home. Animals you would never in a million years label as. Here's where everything changes. Domestic cats are, by a wide margin, one of the most efficient and most overlooked removers of bird carcasses in suburban and urban environments anywhere on the continent. A landmark study published in the journal Nature Communications, led by Scott Loss, Tom Will, and Peter Mara, estimated that free-ranging domestic cats in the United States kill somewhere between 1.3 and 4 billion birds every single year. billion, with a B, and that number, staggering as it already is, doesn't even capture the full picture. Because cats don't only kill live, healthy birds, they also scavenge. A dying or already dead bird lying on the ground is an easy meal. No hunting skill required, no risk involved. And cats patrol the same territory night after night, often at hours when you are fast asleep and have no idea your yard is being worked over by a quiet, methodical predator. A cat finds a dead bird on your lawn at 3 in the morning. By the time you walk outside the next day, there is nothing there. You never knew it existed. You never will. And cats are only one entry on a much longer list. Raccoons, opossums, skunks, and foxes. All increasingly common not just in rural areas, but in dense, suburban, and even urban environments. Are opportunistic scavengers that don't care how fresh a carcass is. They'll take a bird in almost any stage of decay, day or night, without hesitation. Crows and ravens, two of the most cognitively advanced birds on the planet, are constantly scanning their territory for exactly this kind of opportunity, and will remove a dead bird the moment they find one. Blue jays, despite their reputation as sea-dandat eaters, are fully capable scavengers when the opportunity presents itself. Even scarils, animals most people would swear are strictly vegetarian, will consume bird carcasses for protein, particularly in the leaner months of winter when other food sources thin out. The network of animals quietly erasing bird mortality from your visual field is larger, more diverse, and more relentless than almost anyone realizes. And it operates every hour of every day, whether you're watching or not. The efficiency of this scavenging network is so high that researchers who actually study bird mortality in the field have to check the same locations multiple times a day if they want any chance of documenting a death before the physical evidence is gone. Multiple times a day. Professional scientists, people whose entire job is finding these bodies, still struggle to outrun the speed at which the evidence disappears. If trained researchers with a specific purpose and a checklist still lose the race against scavenger efficiency, what realistic chance did you ever have of stumbling onto a dead bird during an ordinary walk to get your mail? But here's where the story takes a darker turn, because there is a third mechanism at work, and it's arguably the most unsettling of the three. Not because it's gruesome, but because it means some birds never produce a body at all. Predation, by its very nature, often doesn't leave anything behind in the place where the death actually happened. Consider a sharp-shinned hawk taking a chickadee mid-flight. There is no carcass on the ground beneath where that happened. The hawk carries its prey to a perch somewhere else entirely, consumes it there, and discards the indigestible remains. Bones, a few feathers, in a completely different location than the one where you might have witnessed anything. A Cooper's hawk strikes a mourning dove at your backyard feeder. You hear the commotion, maybe catch a burst of motion out of the corner of your eye. An explosion of feathers suspended in midair for a half-second. By the time you actually get up and walk outside to look, the hawk is gone. So is the dove. What remains is a scattering of feathers on the grass, and within the hour, even those blow away in the wind or get collected by other birds for nest material. The evidence disappears almost as fast as the death itself occurred. And owls take this to an entirely different level of completeness. A great horned owl or a screech owl hunting after dark will take a sleeping bird directly off its roost in total darkness, in total silence, with a kill so efficient and so quiet that nothing about the event would ever register to a human observer even if you were standing 20 feet away. The owl consumes its prey whole or in large sections, and hours later, sometimes a considerable distance from where the kill actually took place, a pellet containing whatever indigestible material remains. Bones, fur, the compressed husk of feathers. You will never see the bird. You will never witness the predation event itself. The only trace that anything happened at all is a small, unremarkable pellet sitting beneath a tree somewhere. And unless you know exactly what you're looking at and exactly where to look, you will walk straight past it without a flicker of recognition. So now stack all three of these systems on top of each other and really sit with what that means. A dying bird's own instincts drive it into hiding before death ever occurs. Any carcass that does end up exposed gets removed by an aggressive, overlapping network of scavengers, within a window measured in hours, sometimes minutes. And a significant percentage of bird deaths never produce a visible body in the first place, because predation consumes the evidence as part of the act itself. The statistical odds of you Specifically, standing in the right place, at the right narrow window of time, looking directly at the right patch of exposed ground. Before any of these three systems has done its work, those odds are vanishingly small. Your sense that you almost never see dead birds isn't a perception problem. It is an accurate read of a system that has been engineered by millions of years of evolutionary pressure to erase its own evidence with ruthless efficiency. That, on its own, would already be a satisfying answer to the question. Mystery solved. Case closed. Nothing more to see. Except there's a second part to this story that researchers have only started taking seriously in the last decade and a half, and it pushes the entire conversation somewhere far stranger than simple ecology. Because the question isn't only where do the bodies go. There's a deeper question hiding underneath it that scientists have been quietly investigating. Do birds know what death actually is? For a long time, the working assumption in ornithology was a flat no, that birds simply lacked the cognitive machinery required to understand mortality as a concept, that a dead bird registers to a living bird as nothing more than an inert object, no different from a fallen branch. That assumption has not held up well under direct experimental testing, and the species responsible for tearing it apart are the corvids crows, ravens, jays, and magpies. In 2015, Kelly Swift and John Marsleff at the University of Washington published findings that should change how you think about every crow you've ever dismissed as just a bird. Their experiments showed that wild American crows, when they encounter a dead crow, do not ignore it and move on. They gather. Sometimes, in staggering numbers, researchers conducting these experiments described scenes where more than 40 crows converged from every direction at once, descending on the area in a tightening vocal swarm. The crows call loudly, circle overhead, land near the body, and remain in the immediate area for extended stretches of time. This wasn't a one-off fluke. It happened consistently, across different crow populations, in different locations, under controlled experimental conditions designed specifically to rule out other explanations. And critically, the crows weren't responding to a live threat. There was no predator in the area causing the reaction. They were responding to the dead body itself. Here's where it gets even more striking. And this is the detail most people have never heard. After encountering a dead crow in a specific location, the surviving crows didn't just react in the moment and forget about it. They changed their future behavior. For the following 3 days, crows that had witnessed the death event measurably increased the time it took them to approach food in that same area. Even though the food was right there, even though nothing was actively threatening them anymore, the presence of a dead crow had functionally relabeled that location as dangerous in the minds of the living birds. They had taken information from someone else's death and used it to update their own risk assessment of the world. That is not nothing. That is not simple instinct firing on a loop. That is something closer to learning, closer to memory, closer to the kind of cognitive process we'd unhesitatingly call intelligent if we saw it in a mammal. And the same research team had already shown, years earlier, just how far crow memory extends. In an entirely separate study, Marsleff's team demonstrated that wild crows exposed to a single person wearing a distinctive mask while trapping and banding them would continue to recognize and aggressively scold that exact mask, that exact dangerous face, for at least 2.7 years afterward. Nearly 3 years. A single negative encounter, remembered and acted on, almost 3 years later. Now put that fact next to the funeral behavior and ask yourself what it actually implies. These are animals capable of forming long-term associative memories tied to specific threats, and they are capable of treating the death of one of their own as exactly that kind of threat-defining event. One important enough to encode, remember, and act on 4 days, possibly far longer than researchers have even had the chance to measure. Crows aren't the only corvids doing this. In 2012, a separate research team, led by Teresa Iglesias at the University of California, Davis, ran a series of controlled experiments, specifically on western scrub jays, a species that, unlike crows, is famously antisocial and territorial, birds that actively avoid friendly contact with other scrub jays. Outside of a breeding pair, and yet, when Iglesias placed a dead jay in residential backyards where wild scrub jays were already feeding, the reaction was immediate and dramatic. The first jay to spot the body let out a specific, repeated alarm call, and within moments, other jays from the surrounding area converged on the location, perching nearby, joining the calling, creating a screeching, cacophonous gathering that in some cases lasted up to 30 straight minutes. Naturally, solitary, territorial birds suddenly behaving as a coordinated group. The moment death entered the picture, and the aftershock of that gathering wasn't brief either. In some documented cases, the jays didn't return to normal foraging behavior for more than a day afterward. One single death event was enough to disrupt an entire group's behavior for 24 hours or longer. Iglesias herself, the scientist who ran this study, was careful, appropriately careful, not to overreach with the conclusions. She has stated directly that calling this behavior a funeral doesn't necessarily mean there's an emotional or ritual component, the way we'd understand it in human grief, because, in her words, we simply don't yet know enough about the emotional lives of birds to make that claim with confidence. But she also refused to rule out the possibility entirely, saying there's a real chance that birds have a far richer social and emotional inner life than science has historically given them credit for. That's an important distinction to hold on to. This isn't proof of grief in any poetic sense. It is proof of something, a consistent, coordinated, socially complex response to death that goes far beyond simple indifference. Then there's the magpie story, and this one deserves to be told carefully, because it sits in a slightly different category than the crow and jay research. In 2009, behavioral ecologist Mark Bekoff documented a personal observation, not a controlled lab experiment, but a real-time field account of 4 magpies gathered around the body of a fallen magpie on a roadside. According to his account, one magpie approached the corpse, gently pecked at it, and stepped back. A second magpie did the same. Then one of the magpies flew off, returned carrying grass in its beak, and laid it down beside the body. Another magpie repeated the gesture. All 4 then stood near the body for a period of stillness before eventually dispersing, one by one. It is a vivid, almost eerie image, and it deserves to be treated honestly. This is a single documented anecdotal observation, not a repeated, peer-reviewed experimental study like the crow and jay research, but it is far from the only report of its kind. Bekoff has since collected numerous similar accounts from other observers describing comparable behavior in magpies, ravens, and crows, suggesting this might be a genuine, recurring pattern that simply hasn't yet been pinned down under laboratory conditions the way the UW and UC Davis studies were. Step back now and look at what you're actually holding. For decades, the dominant scientific assumption was that death meant nothing to a bird beyond the disappearance of a body from its environment. And now you have multiple independent lines of evidence, controlled university research, and consistent field observation alike, pointing towards something else entirely. Crows that gather, learn, and change their long-term behavior around death. Territorial, antisocial jays that abandon their solitary nature. The one of their own magpies that may be engaging in something that looks, to any honest observer, disturbingly close to a ritual. None of this proves birds understand mortality the way a human does, contemplating their own eventual end in some abstract philosophical sense. But it absolutely proves they are not blank to it either. Something is happening inside these animals. When they encounter death, something that gets encoded, remembered, and acted on. And for most ordinary songbirds, the cardinals, the robins, the sparrows that make up the bulk of what you see at your feeder, the evidence is thinner. And it's important to be honest about that too, rather than stretch the data further than it can go. There are anecdotal accounts of robins or cardinals lingering near a dead mate, calling repeatedly, behaving in ways that look like distress to a human observer. But anecdote isn't proof, and these behaviors have other plausible explanations that don't require any concept of death at all. Continued territorial defense, simple confusion, or perbanding behavior that simply hasn't yet updated to register the partner's absence. Whether the gap between corvids and ordinary songbirds reflects a real difference in cognitive capacity, a difference in social structure, or simply a difference in how much energy a small, resource-strapped bird can afford to spend on anything beyond immediate survival, there remains a genuinely open question in the field, and it's one researchers are still actively working to answer. Now, here's where this stops being a curious biological footnote and becomes something with real weight, because everything you've just learned about disappearing bodies, impossible, Death awareness sits on top of a much larger and far more consequential fact, one that has almost nothing to do with where individual carcasses end up, and everything to do with how many birds exist at all. In 2019, a team of researchers led by Ken Rosenberg at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology published a study in the journal Science that should have changed how every person on this continent thinks about the sky above their head. Analyzing population data spanning nearly 5 decades across more than 500 species, the study found a net loss of approximately 2.9 billion birds across North America since 1970. 2.9 billion, a 29% drop in total bird abundance in less than 50 years. Of the 529 species studied, 303, 57%, showed measurable population declines, including 19 widespread, common landbird species that had each individually lost more than 50 million birds. Sit with that number for a second, because it reframes everything that came before it. The reason you don't see dead birds isn't only about hidden carcasses and efficient scavengers anymore. It's also, quietly, about there simply being fewer birds left to die in front of you in the first place. The skies you grew up under are not the same skies your grandparents grew up under. Something close to a third of the birds that should be filling the trees, the wires, the fields around you, simply aren't there anymore. Not hidden in the underbrush, not consumed by a scavenger in the dead of night, but gone from the population entirely, lost to habitat loss, to pesticide exposure, to the slow accumulation of human pressure on landscapes that birds depend on to survive long enough to die naturally at all. This is the part where the story stops being a clever piece of trivia about hidden carcasses and becomes something closer to a quiet warning. The system's hiding bird death from your eyes. The concealment instinct, the scavenger network, the silent efficiency of predation. Those systems aren't broken. They're working exactly as they always have, exactly as evolution built them to work. What's changed is the scale of what's flowing through them. Fewer birds being born, fewer birds surviving their first year, fewer birds reaching adulthood to ever face that final hidden moment in the underbrush at all. The absence you've been noticing your whole life, without quite registering it, the missing boat. The empty patches of grass where Logic says a carcass should be, was always there for ecological reasons, but layered on top of that now is a second, much larger absence. One measured not in hours or carcasses, but in billions of individual lives that simply never got the chance to live out the strange, hidden death this entire story has been describing. So where does that leave us? You now know more about the biology of bird death than the overwhelming majority of people will ever learn in their lifetime. You know that a dying bird retreats into cover by instinct, the same instinct that once kept it alive against predators, now repurposed to erase the evidence of its own end. You know that any exposed carcass is swept off the landscape by a scavenging network that includes the cat sleeping on your couch right now, operating with a speed and thoroughness that outpaces professional researchers paid specifically to find these bodies. You know that predation itself, in many cases, leaves nothing behind to find it all, the death and the disappearance happening as a single, seamless act. And you know that at least some birds, crows that gather and remember, jays that abandon solitude in the face of death, magpies that may be laying something disturbingly close to a wreath, appear to carry some form of recognition that death is not simply absence, but something worth responding to. What you don't know, what no one fully knows yet, is how far that recognition actually extends, or what it would even mean to find out. Is a crow's 3-day avoidance of a death site evidence of something we'd recognize as grief, if we saw it clearly enough? Or is it simply a sophisticated risk calculation with no inner experience attached to it at all? Is the scrub jay's cacophonous gathering communication? Ritual? Neither. Or something that doesn't map onto any human category we currently have language for? And as the total population of birds on this continent continues to shrink, generation after generation, what happens to behaviors like these? Behaviors that depend on enough individuals existing, close enough together, for a death to even be witnessed by another member of the same species in the first place. Does a vanishing population mean a vanishing witness? And does a vanishing witness mean these strange, half-understood rituals simply fade out, along with everything else, disappearing as quietly and completely as the bodies themselves always have? The next time you walk through your own backyard, past the same overgrown hedge you've ignored for years, past the same patch of tall grass at the edge of your fence line, understand that you are walking past more than you think. You are walking past a hidden, ongoing, perfectly efficient machinery of disappearance that has been running unnoticed your entire life. And somewhere in that machinery, in ways science still hasn't fully mapped, there may be minds quietly registering loss in a way we are only just beginning to take seriously. Tell me, have you ever actually found a dead bird? Where was it? What species? And knowing everything you know now, ask yourself honestly, how long do you think it had really been there before you finally saw it?